Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to Friends of Europe's first Critical Thinking Live of the year. Last January, we woke up to a very different world to the January we wake up to now. We've had war, we've had the energy crisis of livelihoods. People don't know whether to eat or feed, or to heat. People are worried about what their future holds for them. Young generations are thinking, oh my goodness, that older generation has basically eaten up all the glory and we're left with a dud planet. There are many in this universe who are thinking, my world, in our generations, we never imagined that we would have that combination of factors which are about a war in our neighborhood, the biggest energy crisis we've experienced ever. Figures that, in terms of inflation, that are eye-watering, that we thought we would never witness again. And here we are. In 2023, waking up to a very different world. How do we make sense of that world and what we can do? I'm joined by Sven Smit, who is chair of McKinsey Global Institute and senior partner at McKinsey, to provide his thoughts. He's a big brain with a lot of big analysis and the aptitude to not to soothsay, but to provide us with a steer and a guidance about what we might think about, what's in the near term and what we should think about into the long term. So for the basis for that conversation is a new report that McKinsey Global Institute have come out with, which is on the cusp of a new era. Sven, it's a really good pleasure to welcome you. It's back again with us. I hope you are well. And also you've just come back from Davos, I believe, so you can share some of your thoughts on what the creme de la creme of the world was thinking about in terms of world matters. So, but firstly, thank you for being with us. And can you say a little bit about why a new era? What's the thinking behind your report in setting out some of the dramatic things that you do in it? Over to you, Sven.
Thank you for having us. It's great to be with the Friends of Europe. When we think about movements through time, what we're used to is to think about a business cycle, a cycle like the dot-com, a cycle like the financial crisis, a cycle like COVID, which of course was recent and deep. Those cycles are demand cycles. And our pattern to go through them is really that we get afraid of something. All tech companies are gone, the financial system is broken, our lives are broken because of COVID. And we get afraid, we stop spending, the economy gets a shock. The first shock is deep in the first quarter, and most often the second quarter there's already some recovery, and in the third quarter we're back. Why? Because we get some signals of optimism. Not all tech companies were gone, our money wasn't gone in the financial crisis, and we actually found a way to live in lockdowns, to even spend and get our lives organized. And we heard about vaccines and got optimistic, and then basically life is back. It's not perfect. We have to change things. We regulate certain things and we change certain rules by which we live. But basically you go from fear to optimism and we're through. History has had bigger moments than that. And what we're suggesting is it could be that we are at such a bigger moment, which we call the cusp of a new era. If we look back from the Second World War, there was a period from the war till the 70s, which you can call the post-war boom, which was maybe in an era in which lots of stuff was clear. We were reconstructing Europe and Japan. The poverty in the rest of the world started to be diminished. And we basically were rebuilding to everybody their house, their car, in the Western world, their fridge and so on, and the first levels of that in poorer countries. But that was clear. And we had all the supply of oil that we needed and energy and so on was clear. The 70s had a shock, a supply shock. And I would say the 70s was the last time we had a similar supply shock as we have now. Global in scale, cuts at energy, cuts at food, has geopolitical dimensions, challenges the world order. And that actually lasted all the way till the late 80s, early 90s, when the USSR dissolved and we got into what we coined the global era of markets. And actually, for most leaders in the world, that global era of markets has been the entire time that they were in a leadership position. And they're used to having been conditioned that you could count on supply, you could count on energy, you could count on some sort of geopolitical collaboration. Of course, there were small wars and complexity. And yes, you could count on business cycles that come and go. But at this moment in time, we are in a geopolitical set of questions, which were at Davos. We are in a supply crisis on multiple dimensions. The demographics are no longer a tailwind. The energy is short, and we want to transition. And the economics of the last 30 years, which was low interest rates, benign inflation and so on, are also challenged. Now, it could be that, it'll all come down next year and this year, and then we're done, and it was a business cycle. But the fact that you have this congruence of geopolitics, which are serious questions and so on, and just you could feel it in Davos, but you can feel it in every CEO conversation. The list of issues is longer and the answers are not so clear. And by the time we have the answers to the forks in the road that we face now, we would think that if you look back on it, that we will call it something different. In Davos, we had a session on this, and there was even a question to me, which is, how would you call this new era? And I said, honestly, I think you name it in hindsight, not with foresight. And I think the global era of markets grew on us rather than it was defined at a distinct moment and we all checked the box to go there. But we're thinking that we are at this moment that bigger shifts are occurring, that we will at some point give a name, and in 20 years hence call a new era.
And I take that notion of, what should we call it? Because, you tend to find those who are, let's say, spin merchants want to be able to define things and give it a groovy, funky title. But the more important fundamental shifts you're describing, and if we listen to you carefully, is that we are no longer going to be in a boom and bust cycle, if I get you right. The fact that actually the tectonic plates have changed under the globe so phenomenally that everything we knew and have understood as being a cycle is coming to an end. And what's, I think, quite startling and quite interesting about what you say is our current leadership across the world has normed itself in a boom and bust cycle, and it's been normed by an economic theory that thinks that actually we'll weather the storm. We need to make sure we actually do some certain things to actually reduce inflation, and they received wisdom about how government should operate. A little bit of pain, which probably means the poorest people in our world will suffer, but we'll get through it. Can you say, and we'll come back to that notion about what we do about economics and what government should do, but you just made reference to geopolitics, right? You've been at Davos, and we know that there's this been ricocheting of relationships between China, India, the rise of Africa. We know that post-Trump we can take a bit of a breath and think actually a liberal order has been re-established, but we don't know because Trump may come back in a different guise. But when we think about economic flows and interdependencies, can you say a little bit about how you see that going, what we need to be thinking about, rather than, and my question, and there's a lot in what I've said, so say a little bit about geopolitics and flows, but how then that winds into this notion of sovereignty and, the notion post-COVID that actually we can do it on our soil. Let's just bring everything up and put the barricades up.
Yeah, so we wrote a separate report to deep dive in that branch of the new era, which is talking about global flows and the degree to which we're an interconnected world. A few messages from that are clear, and they should be the foundation of thinking about the geopolitics, which is that no region can be an island. At least all regions have some materials, some energy flows, food flows, where they are more than 25% dependent on somebody else. Of course, there's a variance. The US typically has more energy and more materials under its base than Europe. China is a large producer, but uses actually material from the rest of the world. So the roles of each region is different, but the interdependency is very, very significant. You can look at the material world. Some materials just essentially come from 3 countries at the moment. Now, what we can do about it is maybe you design the materials out, you make a new battery with a different makeup that doesn't need to be that dependent. And that work is being done, but it takes time. The big issue is this dependency. Maybe you could resettle in 20 years. The question is, what do you do in 2? And how do you actually maintain collaboration if you signal intent of separation in 10 years? While in 2 years, you still need to collaborate of the interdependency. But even if you had an intent to separate more, we think it's going to be very hard. And a lot of the benefit of these flows will be at the risk. And there is a 2-sided benefit. Of course, this global era of markets with this interconnection brought the largest reduction in global inequality. that we've seen on the planet. And it really, we now discussing, which we'll get to later, that the poverty line might not be the right line anymore. And that is, of course, because we shifted work and so on, but at the same time, there is still enough work in Europe and the US and Japan that shifted out. Just to imagine when people say, let's just nearshore, friendshore, there's more than 100 million people doing the work for Europe and the US outside Europe, making stuff, garments, electronics, and so on. And so it's kind of hard to imagine that we will have additional 100 million people in, places where even population decline is being discussed. So the practicality would suggest, or the pragmatism would suggest, no matter what we do, we'll need to find a new way in this world to establish collaboration. Would that mean a bit more bilateral rather than open market? Would that mean, quid pro quos across certain regions on certain things? Would that mean that people will negotiate by swim lane? I.e., for defense, it's different, totally decoupled. For milk, it's just a global commodity market, let's say. And what else sits in the middle? And I hope, and that's one of the forks in the road in the new era, is that we don't end up in a completely uncollaborative structure that basically cuts the flows, and the ties that bind us basically get cut in a way that it impedes everybody's lives and prosperity. But the arrangements for that will have to be probably adjusted. And therefore, we also think most MNCs that are, by the way, a very large proportion of these global flows, they are driven by MNCs, are considering strategies to have dual sourcing. They are considering rather than highly concentrated sourcing. Because one of the biggest problems that we have in these flows is many of these flows are very concentrated, i.e. Europe gets a lot from Russia and gas. Certain materials are very concentrated. And what we found is 50% of the flows are super concentrated, but 2/3 of that is by our own choice. You could actually have dual source. So that is a space in which people, I think, will move. And what you would hope is that, call it the more geopolitical battle, which we can't predict here, would find pathways to have pragmatism occur to keep the interconnected world together.
Very helpful, Sven. And I want to kind of focus a little bit on, and I think that's quite illuminating what you're saying, that actually we can't suddenly turn the clock back on globalization. However, the politics might want to kind of spin that and think that actually suddenly we can switch that flick off, the switch off, and the fact that we are denying the benefits of what globalization has brought in terms of, as you quite rightly say, everyone's made more money, and actually classes of people have been lifted up into productivity and meaningful work. We know that. But as you think about the conversations you've had in Davos, but also you speak to chief executives a lot, Sven, and governments, do you think they're having the right kind of conversation? What I mean by that is, do you feel that they've got their heads buried in the sand? Or do you see a shift in thinking that Europe needs to take a different approach to competitiveness and investment potentially and innovation? Do company CEOs want something different? Are they being articulate about it? Share with us your thoughts in how you're reflecting on those conversations that you're part of.
I think we are in a learning moment, if I wanted to define it when I listen to that, because let's take MNCs. Many MNCs have made even public announcements to say we will build some facility outside China, for example, in Vietnam, for example, in India. And the recipients are positioning themselves as the China +1 or something like that location. What people discover is you build a facility, the ecosystem is not there. So initially, and maybe even substantially, the costs are higher, which is this fact that we put the stuff in a place where the comparative advantage was the best, to use an economic term, historically. And so people are learning that it's not that easy. That's one step of the learning process, and that's just businesses doing that. And I'm not talking about the global flow connections, and governments are hearing that too. And I would say we have pragmatism. We're not yet at a zero gas flow coming from the east. Think about that as a level of pragmatism. You have a real geopolitial war, and stuff is still flowing. Call that sort of the extreme pragmatism. I think you raised something, and it's useful to bringing this word of competitiveness in the discussion, which was also a very big discussion in many places. And I would say it's probably even more potent for Europe. Because kind of the US has energy and it's just what they do with it. They have a significant part of the materials. And on that spectrum, Europe is poorer. And then you have the tech battle and the tech gaps and so on. So we have a competitiveness issue, while we're also wanting to do an energy transition and so on. And I think the answer for Europe will have to lie in that the framework by which we do things will need to include competitiveness. And one way to express competitiveness, it means that the input costs for companies are not so prohibitive that they can't compete in global markets, because we will still behave in global markets, which is a major issue and currently severely challenged, in particular in industry, with these energy prices. But at the same time, also think about that the solutions we choose are about affordability for consumers and citizens, which is sort of the flip side of that. And I think that means that with everywhere where we want to do good, and there's a long list in the ESG, SDG, and all goals that you can imagine, including the energy transition, we will have to find a solution that also satisfies competitiveness and affordability. And I believe that is actually a shift that's occurring in the dialogue, because it's becoming very transparent what we had to do in these times with these energy prices. And I think the pinch point here is Europe, because if you go to the Middle East at the moment, it's it's a rich period with these energy prices. So the disparities of this competitiveness issue are quite significant, but we're in a learning moment, that's for sure.
That's really very helpful. I hope that people are listening to some of this in terms, especially those who are in decision-making positions, about what you need to think about and consider around the way in which you drive, let's say, Europe's emerging, new industrial policy. There's not much of it. We've not read much about it. What we've seen is pretty old, and it doesn't seem to have kind of grown up, is my sense. And that's me being wicked. I know I don't mean to be that wicked, but in reality, I've not read something about how the manufacturing base, the digital base, the employment base, the kind of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of digitalization and an industrial competitive strategy, what I would call a digital industrial strategy that's required. Do you get a sense that we are actually really thinking long and hard about how we pull some of these pieces together so that, Europe can try and be much better in this next 50 years than it has in the past 50 years, especially around the fact that it created the internal market, created the fourth largest trading bloc, but actually it's whimpering. What would your advice be to the bloc?
So we've had a lot of discussion on European competitiveness. You've been part of some of those personally also. I think it's very rich territory. I think many of the pieces are being discussed in different places, and many of these pieces are not even wrong. We want to do an energy transition. We want to have a competitive tech industry. We want to have proper innovation. We want, and so the question is whether the mechanism that we have is satisfying. And I'll start with one data point that we wrote in our European competitiveness report, which said if you look at profitability of European companies versus US companies, on average, of course, there's a spectrum in both territories. US companies are just far more profitable than European companies. And as a result, and that's, by the way, after European companies spend 2 points less on R&D. So if they had to spend the 2 point more R&D that we all want, which is policy, we like more R&D, we like more innovation, that profitability gap would become bigger. And the question is, how are we solving the problem? Are we doing it with incentives? And so in a way, the companies are part of the solution and through incentives move themselves forward. Are we solving it with a directive that says, thou shall do this no matter what the profitability consequences are, or with a stick that says, if you do this, this is what you're going to pay or something. In that spectrum, I think there are differences between Europe and the US, and IRA is one of these issues that just is more on the incentives. And if you see what happens if you give incentives, how fast the reaction is, it's super fast. While if it's carrot stick, you're going to get in a defensive reaction. And at the end of the day, we need to decide, do we see companies who, by the way, do produce 70% of the value added in the world, are the solution to these problems? And they almost have to be. And I mean, not just large, it includes the SME spectrum too. And that's the area where I would say Europe needs to think very hard how to get that right. Is it, but by which means are we, because I think the policy intentions are not that different. Everybody wants a clean world, everyone wants the people to be rich have good livelihoods. Everybody wants some growth that helps us go forward. But it's the path to get there. So the pieces are there, but how are they coming together in the right way?
On that note then, can you build on that comment then, just to say, share with us your thinking about the role of government vis-a-vis the private sector? You just talked about the kinds of approaches that you could take and the role of what government and industry can play. You refer to the IRA, which we know from previous conversations that actually the what sounds such a boring title, Inflation Reduction Act, has been an innovation entity on a different level. You've spoken about it, but do we need more regulation? Do we need less regulation? Do we need to be thinking differently about the relationship between public and private sector? Say a little bit about what you see in a year before elections. Next year, we will have our irregular parliamentary elections to the European Parliament, and we'll have a new Commission mandate. People are already writing the policy book now because they have to. You have to plan 24 months ahead. What's your thinking about role of public and private sector as we think about this thing that you say about a new era? We're in a different cycle, and you talked about competition just now, and you've talked about the global flows and the concentration of those. In that context, and I'm going to push you on this, is that what would you say the European Union should do? What should government do vis-a-vis the private sector?
So let me just say one element that I'm nearly certain the new era will include, including the new era for Europe, is that the things we're trying to solve, you can't solve by country. Not all of them you can't solve by country, because gases flow through the air, roads are longer than, and so on. We can debate, and technology infrastructure and so on is just much more global than and regional and so on. But the other point is the solutions in these bigger issues are system issues, and they're not system issues that a company alone can solve. The energy system is very complex, the food system is very complex, and so on. So that means that the intensity to collaborate has to be a lot higher to find out what the right answer is. And then, of course, in the right framework. And where I hope the framework will land is, and we have a little bit of a framework, we think it's possible to achieve sustainable inclusive growth. And that's an and, not an or. We know that it's easy. If you grow more people have a chance to get something of the pie. The bigger pie makes it easier. Inequality is still an issue, but bigger is better for the pie. It's a little more counterintuitive on the sustainable side, because you would usually think sustainability goes down if you do more because you get more footprint. The reality is the burden to go to the renewable energies and cleaner world from a financing perspective is so big that every point of growth actually creates more capacity to do the transition, and it creates additional problems, which is very counterintuitive because we have a stock of problems that we need to still solve. But the one thing that needs to be in the policy frameworks is that if you do these transitions in a way that is not affordable, actually the transition becomes non-inclusive. Because then you see what will happen now. High energy prices are the worst thing for the poor people and for large swaths of the population, actually. And so we will have to add to the framework this affordability point, which can only be achieved if companies add their productivity to the solutions. My sense is that the mix in what we do will have to spend more time on achieving affordability before we scale, rather than to scale not so affordable things, and then as a result basically become less competitive. And then you go into a negative spiral. That balance, I have the feeling we will have to reset in the global debate even, but even more so in Europe. And in that, we will have to make constructs that make it possible for European companies to be competitive, which includes one of the analysis that we talked about this. Europe is at the country level equally concentrated if I think about markets roughly, than the United States and China. But if you look at the regional level, it's actually fragmented. And scale matters in these big decisions. And so we will have to find a way of scale. It's super complex because you get, who wins, who loses, where does the headquarter go, and all that stuff. But we will have to get to that place that allows achieve these solutions. But that means, in my view, yes, you will have very tight regulation, but it should be done in a way that it lands in the right place and it achieves the proper incentives so people will do the work. Because otherwise, we'll just be discussing targets and the work will not happen.
Thank you. I want to, as we kind of tailwheel downwards in this conversation and bring us to a conclusion, there's two big issues I want to talk to you about. One is the role and purpose of money and how we measure productivity. So let's go first to the money question. Is that, you in your reports, you've documented this, is that how do you come out of a period in which public taxpayers' money has underwritten society holistically for over 18 months in various parts? We have public debt at its highest, and you've got economists within government scratching their head thinking, how am I going to square this circle, because I have to make sure services are delivered and I don't know how I'm going to do that, but on the other hand I've got a debt that's massive. So there's something about, do you just continue to print more money? What do we do about the money question?
But let's deal with so there's three thoughts here, and I will come at it, as we always do at MGI, from the micro side rather than the macro side. Not that I have no thoughts about macro, but you could make a point. Some people will say the last period was modern monetary theory squared, because basically we were printing and we had all these, I call it loose money. I think the real reality is, and this is the 70s, have been now analyzed very, very carefully. And there was always this debate, was the 70s a monetary issue, we just had too much money, or was it a supply issue? And of course the answer, it's both. If you print a lot of money and you have no supply, that doesn't work. If you print money while there is supply, it can work. Let me give you an example. We actually went all through it very recently. I would say putting a floor on the economy in Q2 2020, where the skies were falling from the heavens because we didn't know what was going on in COVID, is more than responsible. Because basically the supply is there, but the demand is not there. And so you're not spending against a constraint. I could make an argument that in later stages of this, we know the supply shortages are there. To then spend against the supply shortage, you get inflation. Now that inflation will help to debase the debt. So but what the issue is, of course, all of this is pain distribution. That's the other point I want to make. You can talk long about the level of debt, interest rates, and inflation. The real reality is you can set them at different levels and the pain will go to different places. High inflation means those that save have pain, and those that have small wages have pain. High interest rates is maybe good for the savers, but bad for the people that need to buy a house. And I can keep going. So this is at the end also an equality debate a little bit. But the one thing I know for sure, and we are going back to our roots as MGI here, that productivity is going to be a medicine for all our predicaments. Why? Productivity gives us the growth that can cover the debt. That you grow yourself at the problem. I mean, I don't expect we'll ever pay the debt down. We just debase the debt by growth. Productivity will make stuff cheaper, which means that the inflation goes down. Productivity will make things more affordable, which actually helps to the social contract at the bottom. Productivity will make it easier to deal with deficits of governments and so on. And I can go on. Productivity is always at the core of having a good economy. And I think we know from all the work that's been done, productivity potential exists to do twice as much with the same amount of people with forms of automation. And AI, if I had to say one thing that surprised me, is the chat about ChatGPT. I mean, all the standard issues were there, globalization, supply, but there was more talk about ChatGPT. Of course, there was an event happening at the same time about it, but also people started to experience this. I think that's similar stuff is happening in robotics, similar stuff in other places. So productivity will have to be part of this bailout of the situation. But we have the productivity conundrum, which is that we can see all the benefits of automation everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. So that still needs to be worked. But it does mean that we need to have, you can't spend all this money if you don't get the productivity engine to work and not constrain supply. And of course, what we're doing is we're constraining supply, and we have quite a lot of regulation that impedes productivity. So if you release the brake at the money level, you also need to release the brake at the supply level. That to me is and that's hard work.
It is indeed, especially in a very complex system that we live in. And the fact that now that system is not only trying to learn from the experiences of 20, 25, 30 years of globalization, but also technological advances. And as you say, AI can have the most disruptive influence on global economies potentially, or have the most significant positive impact. But that will require regulation, no?
Yeah, and that's, by the way, again, the fork in the road on the new era. The tech over the last 3 eras went from engineering post-war to consumer electronics to digital, and now we will add AI, automation, robotics at scale. And we can play with that in a way that basically we'll halve the number of people that have work and get very high tension, or we get twice the output with the same number of people, and the prosperity of the world will move on. And that, of course, is the answer. Then we can be closed about it or open. We can get afraid of it or deal with it properly, and so on. And that is that's one of the 5 forks in the road to the new era.
So let's kind of move to conclusion. Some thoughts from you on, let's say, you've said a little bit about the fact that MGI is going back to its roots. You said quite clearly, and that's classic stuff there you're sharing with us, the fact that productivity matters. And the way you're describing productivity is kind of one of the most kind of fundamental pillars of, let's say, economic thinking and analysis, to a certain extent, without being so stupid about it, if you like the way I'm phrasing it. But we know it matters. But the past 4 years, if anything, have taught us, or should learn us, that actually we can't take for granted what economic theory has taught us, because we're living in a new world. And so how do you square the circle, or how do you make sense of inequality? Now, I'm asking you the question that people, what you measure matters, and that drives policies in governments. And they will say, this is where you say whether you make a decision whether pain is. And often governments will say, pain is required, but we'll protect the middle and the higher, but the lower will go through it and will come out of it, right? And what we know at the moment is that 60% of the global population is suffering much more than the rather 40% because of where they sit, where they live, where they work, and where they don't work, right? So tell me a little bit about whether is the mantra of a free market and productivity always going to be there? Can it be the basis for reducing the inequality gap? And can we have a different conversation about markets and money that actually talks about that actually our world would be better, happier, freer, more peaceful if we had more inclusive?
So I think this story is slightly different for, let's call it, the Western world and the emerging world, because of poverty differences. We know that the inequality in emerging markets has significantly, relative to the Western world, significantly changed, but it increased inside countries in those markets as well as it did in the Western world. Again, growth will help because it just makes them, but it doesn't change the inequality, but growth will help all. So we should not forget that, and sustainability will help all if it's affordable. But this affordability point is more fundamental. I see 2 metrics. You of course could say, let's measure happiness, but we have to have something a little bit more tangible to work for. The work we did on social contracts shows very clearly that even while the bottom in Western world has slightly higher income increase than the middle class, so while the middle class is squeezed on income, the bottom is squeezed on affordability. So their incomes don't rise fast enough to keep up with the price rises. And this inflation moment makes that just worse. And what is it that they can't participate in? They can't participate in affordable housing, they can't participate in affordable healthcare, they can't participate in affordable education of high quality. And so that affordability has to become part of the solution as a metric. And then the second way to measure that is to say, what's the income in different countries that actually doesn't get you just to the poverty line, which is, you have most of the time access to food, which is what that line is. There's actually fairly good research that shows that people become empowered once they have an income level that is at the level of having food, having access to health, basic as it might be, having access to education, basic as it might be, and basically having access to affordable housing, as basic as it might be in the different countries. That level is not the $1 a day that we also want to move away from. But in poor countries, it might be 10, 12 to start with. And in richer countries, that level is actually a higher number because of the different PPPs and so on. But the reality is, I don't want to pick the number now. It's actually, I want to discuss the concept, because what the research has shown is that an empowered person can move on. A person that's just about having food, they actually can't get to education because they don't have the time for it. They're still trying to get food, and they still try to get to healthcare, and they don't spend time to be educated because they just need to get the food together. Once they have these, and it's basic Maslow, of course, is once you have the lower levels, you can be empowered to start to participate in society and enhance your education and enhance your participation. And I think and it sounds quite economic, but we also know people that are empowered are happier. So it's not about not thinking about happiness, but maybe affordability and empowerment are better metrics to think about this. And I think the affordability discussion in the West should say, okay, affordable housing, we know what that takes. You have to give the land plots. Yeah, and okay, dear governments, if you have this many people coming into your country, you need to give them this much land at a reasonable price. Otherwise, they will not be part of affordable housing. And maybe our solution might be more in that area than in redistribution of money, because that just raises the price of what is short already. And the affordability crisis might actually not get smaller if you just give people money on something that's short. It's almost the same as we talked at the macro level. You can't throw the money if there is no supply. And we need to have affordable supply. So I hope we can go to affordability and empowerment as additional metrics to growth and sustainability. So that the circle squares.
Brilliant. So from your perspective, I love the phrasing of empowerment gap, because I think there's a more of a positive narrative about that, and it's not judgmental, and it's not finger pointing, and actually it's more of a system response actually, and I think that's great. But so as we move to a final conclusion, do you feel that would also incorporate the sustainability factor? Because there's been a lot of, we've had it at Davos many year on year, is actually, how do we make sure that the auditing frameworks for governments and the private sector, how do we make sure that the measurement factors actually have a sustainability in component, or actually a fundamental look? Do you see the kind of empowerment gap as part of that same narrative?
Yeah, so when we talk sustainable inclusive growth, we actually, and we'll have a paper out on that actually shows the squaring of the circle, which is you can have the growth, every point higher is better, that requires productivity. You have to have the sustainability, but to achieve it, it has to be affordable. Otherwise, it's non-inclusive, but also large parts of the world can't be doing it. And to have inclusion, we would say, let's put it at the empowerment gap, not at the poverty line. If you then look at it, this empowerment might actually be a slightly bigger issue than sustainability. They're both very big, next to growth that needs to fund it all and bring it all. But we might just forget the empowerment side a little bit by just having, so we should solve a circle in a system rather than just a single issue. Let's solve sustainability, set targets, doesn't matter what it costs. No, let's solve empowerment, take the money there, but then kill the golden goose of growth. Let's do growth and forget inclusion and sustainability. That doesn't work either. So the world is a system, and that's the puzzle that government and society needs to solve.
Excellent. I'm glad that you made that point about a whole systems approach, because actually that's what we need. This has been fabulous. It's been fun talking to you, and I can't wait to read some of the stuff they're coming out with, which sounds a bit geeky, I know, on my part. But I hope that we can continue to work with you. And as you know, we started on this journey 3-4 years ago on a renewed social contract. And this year, we launched it last year, that, for the next 10 years, we are focused on the notion of a renewed social contract. And actually this autumn, we're going to identify 10 policy choices. And I think you've given us some ideas for what a couple of those might be, Sven. And we'll count on you to help on working on that. But one final comment, Sven, as we look ahead, I was just ruminating on what you were saying. When we think about the European Commission, there isn't one person you could say has in their job description economic growth? What do I do about, markets? What do I think about every day to help add value to member states? So I think that's quite interesting that you don't think of one person that's got that. And is that right or wrong? I don't know. But Sven, if you imagine you're in the room right now with them, what are the couple of messages you'd say to, let's hope it's her and not a him?
The first one is, maybe we shouldn't have one person, but actually all the people should have the flip side of the coin. You can't just put the stick in that says, thou shalt not do that or now do this. And if you don't, and not have the consequence on growth and affordability in the room. So if every single actor in Europe, in a country at the European level as a business, would square the circle, and that's their debate, rather than pursue a single line item issue at a target level without understanding the deeper system issues, I think you'd get to a better place. Then maybe the sum total as a team could produce the growth. Maybe initially you would have to have somebody in there that maybe pulls it out. And that person, I would say, sustainable inclusive growth is an and, but if you don't do it with affordability and as for companies with ensuring competitiveness, you're going to basically throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that's what we need to prevent.
Sven, great. Thank you very much. A whole systems approach and making sure we take a carrot and stick approach. But let's hope that Team EU is listening, because you're quite right. It should be a governance matter and a performance matter that our dear president takes on board quite dearly. But let's see. Thank you so much. As ever, it's been a pleasure, illuminating. And, I hope that those of you who've been watching and listening have got something out of this. This is, as I said, a curtain raiser on our renewed social contract and the conversations for this year. And I hope that we've got lots of ideas and thoughts on this. If you will have a particular question or an issue you want to raise in response to this, don't hesitate, email us and get in touch. Keep an eye on our website. We have a number of things coming up, but this was our first of the year. And obviously doing that with MGI is important because they are the nerds that think about trends and analysis. So it's been a real pleasure, Sven. Honestly, it's been great. And let's hope that, you can see the trickle effect or the resonation of some of what we've just been saying through discussions in the year, and look forward to welcoming you this October when we will recap on some of these discussions. Thank you very much. Take care, and thank you for listening and watching, and look after yourselves, and see you very soon, either in person or virtually. Take care. Bye-bye.